another mission trip. All right, has everybody gotten the outline for tonight? Okay, good. Well, let me remind you of the primary points we've been looking at. I'm not trying to negate the benefit of psychological therapy. All I'm trying to do is focus on the power of God's grace to bring healing to post-traumatic distress. So that's been our focus, and we're actually looking at the life of Daniel. This is going to be part 4 tonight. We're actually on the 3rd chapter, and from each chapter, I'm trying to take a primary thought that we can use in dealing with post-trauma, but also leaning on God's grace. And remember from chapter 1, the main principle we got from that was to try and focus on a biblical mindset. Just to focus on that. Then from the 2nd chapter, we learned that we need to develop a partnership in prayer. Well, for tonight, we're going to be looking at depending on God and who He is and that He is able. God is worthy and God is able. But before we do that, allow me to read from this book. This is the Combat Trauma Healing Manual. Militaryministry.org puts this out. They're a division of Campus Crusade. But what we're going to read tonight, I think, is apropos to what we're going to be dealing with in tonight in the life of Daniel, and it's also beneficial to what we've looked at before and what we'll be looking at tonight. So just sit back for a couple of moments, enjoy this, listen to it carefully as I read from this. This is about Nathan Self, who at the time was captain of a platoon of Army Rangers. And he makes this statement in the prologue to this manual. After 3 months of fruitless preparation in Afghanistan, my Rangers and I were anxious to make a difference in the war. Then I answered the call that resulted in my becoming the most decorated officer in the global war on terror. A Navy SEAL was missing. His name was Neil Roberts. Neil was also the father of a baby boy, one whom he would never see again. Neil had fallen from his helicopter on top of a mountain in southeastern Afghanistan. He wasn't hurt. He fell maybe 10 feet and into a blanket of powdery snow. But he was not safe, nor was he alone. Neil was quickly surrounded by Al-Qaeda fighters, and as they closed in on him, a small group of U.S. Army Rangers 150 miles away received an order: get him out. I was given command of the mission to rescue Neil Roberts. Neither I nor my Rangers knew who Neil was, but we lived by a creed that expected us to give our lives in order to save another. None of us expected to die, but we did have a promise to keep. On that night, March 3rd, 2002, our promise to leave no man behind would be tested. I had been leading the platoon of Rangers for 18 months, and earlier that evening, I had led them in a Bible study. Contemplating the Psalms, we Rangers were facing our fears, reaching out to God, knowing that we looked death in the face every day. We were actually in the midst of a spiritual revival. Some said we had become a Christian band of brothers. Our faith was also tested that night. As we flew to find Neil, we were ambushed and shot down in our helicopter in the snowy mountains, just feet away from the missing SEAL. None of us had expected to die, but 4 were dead within seconds, including men on my left and on my right. Our rescue mission quickly became a matter of survival, as we were surrounded and outgunned at over 10,000 feet. Despite the overwhelming fire, I felt that God was protecting me through the experience, and I didn't explicitly fear for my life. However, I did think of my wife and son and how they would be affected if I did not come home. Bleeding, outnumbered and alone, I led my Rangers for the next 15 hours in a desperate battle against encroaching Al-Qaeda fighters, reeling from a staggering number of casualties, calling in multiple danger-close airstrikes and fending off the enemy at close range. Our application of skill and determination ultimately resulted in the enemy's demise and the successful recovery of the missing SEAL, but not without a price. We got Neil Roberts' body out at the cost of 6 American lives. For my command and courage under fire in what came to be known as the Battle of Takur Gar, translated Tall Mountain, I was awarded the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, and the Purple Heart. Our story was featured in newspapers, books, and NBC's Dateline. We were celebrated and examined as a model of exemplary combat action within the Army and without. Cadets began to study my actions in the battle at my alma mater and commissioning source, West Point. I became the most recent embodiment of the Academy's saying that much of the history we teach was made by those we taught. The Army used my story as a vignette in its field manual on leadership. But beneath it all, under the armor and the decorations, beyond the praise and the attention, my deep, unseen wounds began to fester. I first began to see a difference in myself when I was attending a 6-month Army educational course. I didn't want to talk to my peers. I felt angry at times, and I wanted to underachieve. However, I felt very drawn back to combat. Within a month of the course, I was in Iraq, where the stresses of combat, the nature of the enemy, and my continued isolation from others led to an onset of intense fear. I began to doubt God's ability to protect me. I began having intense nightmares concerning my family's safety. I knew that after 3 dangerous deployments, I was stacking the odds against my survival. My fear began to crush my faith. I slid backwards into a dark season of running from God, devoid of prayer, fellowship, and time in the Word. I decided to act on my own. I decided to leave the Army. I was a 25-year-old father who led rough and tumble Rangers, first to spiritual revival, and then to victory in the most valorous day in the Special Operations history. But I quietly resigned from the Army, a casualty in the war for the human spirit. My family and I thought leaving the Army would remove me from the dangers of war. I had survived war and had come home safe at last. Now I could focus on being a parent and a husband. But upon leaving the Army, I entered a different kind of fight. The war for my own heart and mind. I went face to face with my memories and the horrors and stresses of combat and lost. I rejected my family and my faith. I isolated myself, refusing to talk about the details of combat with those that I loved the most. Nightmares of war and death haunted me. I gained weight, struggled with my job. Questions and doubts ravaged my mind. Why did I survive and my men die? Why did they send me there? Why does God allow such terrible wars to happen? Why can't I feel anything? Ashamed of the man I had become and unable to reconcile war, I reached a breaking point. I had led Americans in the highest battle ever fought. I toiled close up with battle-hardened Chechens, Uzbeks, and Arabs. I was highly praised and decorated for leadership under fire, yet I anguished in the aftermath of war. As a prisoner of an unseen enemy, I asked myself one more question. How should I kill myself? I realized I was about to lose everything, my marriage, my family, even my life. I had led a daring rescue mission and found myself in dire need of rescuing. I had fought to keep a promise to never leave a fallen comrade. But who would keep that promise with me? I found a deeper appreciation. The answer to that question is clear. God. I laid broken in front of my Savior, Jesus Christ. I began to look for encouragement in the Bible, and it was there. God used a small group of heroes, my family, along with a few Christian brothers, to seek out and rescue the man I once was. They pulled me out of the clutches of despair and walked with me along the path of healing. They found me a Christian counselor, a retired Army chaplain, to minister to me. They helped me get help at the Veterans Affairs Hospital. They listened. Their abiding love, their forbearance, and their constant care made a difference for me. But most importantly, my return to faith in God resulted in my recovery from PTSD. I found a deeper appreciation for God's sovereignty, His willingness to suffer with us, and the power of forgiveness. I believed once again that I had nothing to fear, and I recognized fear was a tool in Satan's disassembling of my faith. I saw examples in the Bible of God's redemptive power, that whatever Satan meant for evil, God had used for good. Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. I saw that war was a part of God's plan, and that the Lord is a warrior, according to Exodus 15:3, and that even King David suffered the effects of killing and combat, and that God could restore everything in me, and that He would replace the years that I had lost, according to Joel chapter 2, verse number 25. Just as Ezekiel 37 explains, God has the power to take my old dry bones off of the desert floor, to make them stand erect, to make them regenerate flesh and sinews, and most importantly, to breathe life in them again. God has shown me opportunities to minister to others through my experiences. These opportunities have reinforced to me that no matter how badly I foul up my life, no matter how tight a grasp Satan may think he has on me, God can take any circumstance and use it to His glory. I know God's plan for me includes using all my mistakes, my pain, my brokenness, to minister to those in like circumstances. God wastes nothing. He's given me opportunities to minister to veterans in my own church, to my close friends who still lead soldiers in Afghanistan and Iraq, to former service members across the world, and to churches. I pray that this message to you is one of the ways God can use my hard-fought and hard-learned lessons in walking with Him to His edification and to His glory. In the end, my story displays that the most powerful sacrifices were made by those who entered into my pain, and ultimately by my Savior, who kept His promise to me to never leave a fallen comrade. Nathan Self, former captain in the U.S. Army. I never heard this story, only because at the same time that this was going on, we were in Venezuela with the trauma of my son's near drowning accident, where it was after that point we're working with him. So it was a blessing to read that about Nathan Self. His openness and his transparency with other people and the journey that he had in his problems. So God's grace was the answer to Nathan's journey. And I believe that God's grace is still the answer to the journey that those are dealing with that are going through post-traumatic stress. Well, I hope you have your outlines, because now we're in chapter 3, and of course this is the story most everybody knows of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. Never leave a comrade alone. It's in a sense part of the theme that we'll be looking at tonight. But as you can see on your outline, the main point of chapter 3 is depend on a God who is worthy and able. So let me ask you this question. Do you depend on a God who is worthy and able? Sometimes we're eager to shake the head, to be seen of others, to affirm and encourage others. But when it comes down to your personal trauma that God has allowed to come into your life, do you still believe that your God is worthy and He is able to bring you through it? That's where we have to come to. Our God is great. There is nothing that is impossible for Him. He is worthy and He is able. Tonight we are going to focus on some trauma. Usually as we go through our chapters, the trauma, I would ask you, what trauma did Daniel encounter this week? How many of you were able to read chapter 3? You go through it and you think, wow, what trauma is here? Well, obviously you noticed as you were reading through chapter 3, who does not appear? What character? Daniel. We don't see Daniel at all in chapter 3. So we may think, well, obviously Daniel's not teaching us anything about trauma. Well, according to the Vernoy version of the Bible, I say that jokingly, I want to look at some possibilities and take us back in time to what was going on. So as we look at the trauma, let's notice number one. The first trauma here is unknown plans being formulated. Now, of course, most times that develops into anxiety. Let's go ahead and read the verses that are in Daniel chapter 3. Let's go ahead and read verses 1 through 3. Nebuchadnezzar, the king, made an image of gold, the height of which was 60 cubits, and its width 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Now, let me insert here. Archaeology has located about 6.5 miles due southwest of Babylon, a plain area. And they did actually uncover an area where there was just a huge, I can't remember the actual dimensions, but it was bricks, a foundation of bricks, but it went deep. And you have to think, well, what was that for? Because around that, they didn't find any other permanent construction of stone or any other type rock works. There was just this foundation of blocks that was in the dirt. You have to remember that it's a desert area, and here was located this foundation. But the plain of Dura, if you can just imagine off in the distance, miles away, it's surrounded by mountains. So if this is the area where Nebuchadnezzar sets up this image, we're going to find out that people came from many places. And as they end up coming, the scripture talks about the image being 60 cubits and its width 6 cubits. Most of the theologians and the scholars end up saying that's probably to the equivalent of 90 feet high by about 10 feet wide. So you wouldn't really think of it being an actual figure of a man because the dimensions aren't quite correct, but it's more of an obelisk. But being that this is a flat level plain and it's surrounded by mountains, you can imagine if you're a traveler from a far province coming in, you're going to see this image from a long way away. Now, let's read the other verses, and let me fill in a little bit more of some of the detail. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent word to assemble the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Then the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, and the counselors, and the treasurers, the judges, and the magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces were assembled for the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Remember in chapter 2, what dream was it that Daniel had interpreted that King Nebuchadnezzar had? Remember, it was the dream of a statue, the head of gold, ended up having the different elements and the body parts as it went down. Then Nebuchadnezzar ended up saying that, a rock that was not made with hands came and destroyed the whole statue. Daniel gives the interpretation of it, and from that particular point, Daniel was exalted within the kingdom and, rewarded for his interpretation because it did match. The king understood it, and King Nebuchadnezzar now realizes that he was the head of gold. 10 years have passed. Daniel, who was 15, we estimate is now 20 to 25 years old, kind of like our young men here on the front. Just a young man yet. But yet Daniel is still in his position, and Daniel is still part of the king's court and is there all the time. But right now we begin to see that there were unknown plans that Daniel did not know about. In fact, even the satraps, the governors, the prefects, all the leaders of the provinces, they were thinking, this is the dedication for an image, and we're going to come. And Daniel thought, dedication of an image. Gold, Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon. I'm sure Daniel begins to think, well, what is Nebuchadnezzar going to do with his dream that I interpreted for him? 10 years into his reign, Nebuchadnezzar's comfortable. The only major battle yet to be fought is the fall of Jerusalem, just shortly to come within 10 years. Daniel is still current with all the events that are going on, and he's thinking in his mind, what have I interpreted for Nebuchadnezzar? How much of the planning Daniel knew, we don't know. Whether he knew of the expenditures that were being done, whether he knew of the construction that was being done. All it says is that Nebuchadnezzar had an image made. Nebuchadnezzar sent word out for everyone to come. Now, keep in mind, we're also talking about a fiery furnace. If you read the chapter, you also know that apparently the king and his court were on some temporary structure that was built up. We also know that the king ended up giving instruction to the men in the furnace to stoke it so that it was 7 times hotter. So if there's a temporary furnace that has been built, that has the doors down on a bottom level to where the men are stoking it, you have an upper level where the king and his court are, and then you have people that are all around that see this 90-foot statue that's being there. Now they hear dedication for the image. They're thinking, oh, a fiery furnace. That's obviously going to be for sacrifices that they're probably going to use to dedicate this particular image. No one's thinking anything the worse for it, but yet Daniel all the time is probably thinking, what is he going to do? That can cause anxiety, right? All right, let's notice the second one. Number 2, it's the inability to effect change or to avoid conflict. Now let's look at verse number 4, and let's go down through verse number 12. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "To you the command is given, O peoples, nations, and men of every language." Now, let me stop here just for a second. In the previous verses, we have made an obvious assumption that these are just Babylonians that are here. The governors, satraps, leaders of the provinces, the prefects, the military leaders are there. The civil leaders of the provinces are all there. But now when the herald ends up saying, people of all languages, all tongues, all nations, many nations there were captured, But there were probably very good chance that there were other nations that were there that were considered vassal kingdoms that had to be there because they were paying tribute to King Nebuchadnezzar. One of those vassal kingdoms, Judah. Israel has already been taken into captivity some 100 years before, 150 years before. Judah is the remaining nation of the Israelites. Zedekiah, in fact, if you would, we need to chase down a verse here. Go to Jeremiah 51:59. And let's notice a little note that's given in just one particular verse. Now, remember we had talked about Daniel and Jeremiah, contemporaries as prophets. Jeremiah was already a tenured prophet, had already spoken to various Judean kings. And of course, Daniel was just a boy of noble blood who obviously had heard of Jeremiah, even is studying the book of Jeremiah in his later years as he is still within the Babylonian kingdom. But in Jeremiah chapter 51, verse number 59. Now, if you'll notice, the majority of chapter 51 is a prophetic judgment that Jeremiah gives against Babylon. Okay? So, it ends in verse number 58. Look at verse 59. The message which Jeremiah the prophet commanded Seraiah, the son of Neriah, the grandson of Maaseiah, when he went with Zedekiah, king of Judah, to where? Babylon, in the 4th year of his reign. Zedekiah reigned 11 years. Judah is still in its land. The kingdom of Judah still exists. Zedekiah is the last king of Judah before they fall before the Babylonians. But here, Zedekiah ends up making a trip to Babylon. Why? That's the obvious question. Jeremiah does not mention any other details, but we do know that Zedekiah ends up making this trip. Notice as well, too, let's read some more. So Jeremiah, verse 60, wrote in a single scroll all the calamity which would come upon Babylon, that is, all these words which have been written concerning Babylon. Then Jeremiah said to Seraiah, as soon as you come to Babylon, in other words, this was not a proposed trip. This was a trip that took place. Jeremiah gives a prophecy against Babylon and to King Zedekiah and the entourage that was traveling with him. Seraiah just happened to be the brother of Baruch, who was the clerk that did all the writing for the prophet Jeremiah. So as they end up going, we know that this was not a proposed journey that was at the last minute canceled. This journey took place. Zedekiah went to Babylon. Well, notice what it goes on to say. Verse number 61, then Jeremiah said to Seraiah, as soon as you come to Babylon, then see that you read all these words aloud and say, you, O Lord, have promised concerning this place to cut it off so that there will be nothing dwelling in it, whether man or beast, but it will be a perpetual desolation. And as soon as you finish reading this scroll, you will tie a stone to it and throw it into the middle of the Euphrates and say, just so shall Babylon sink down and not rise again because of the calamity that I am going to bring upon her, and they will become exhausted. Thus far are the words of Jeremiah. The journey took place. Jeremiah prophesies against the fall of Babylon, but we know that Nebuchadnezzar reigned 40 years, and we're still only within the first 10 years. Jeremiah was a legit prophet, and what did happen to Babylon did come true. But nonetheless, there was a trip. So if there were the possibility of vassal kingdoms and representatives being there, you can imagine the size of all the people that were on this plain ready to dedicate this image that Nebuchadnezzar had raised up. An image that probably not made of solid gold, just the dimensions are tough to engineer, but probably an image that was overlaid in gold. But you can imagine with your imagination just the sight of all these peoples that were here. Verse number 4. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "To you the command is given, O peoples, nations, and men of every language, that at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, the trigon, the psaltery, the bagpipe, and all kinds of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. But whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire." Oh, we're not just offering a sacrifice to a god in dedication for this image. Whoever does not obey will be cast into this fire to be burned alive. That changes the whole scenario of what's going on here. Verse 7, "Therefore at the time when all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, the trigon, the psaltery, the bagpipe, and all kinds of music, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language fell down and worshiped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. For this reason, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and brought charges against the Jews. And they responded and said to Nebuchadnezzar the king, 'O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, the trigon, the psaltery, the bagpipe, and all kinds of music is to fall down and worship the golden image. But whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of a furnace of fire. There are certain Jews here whom you have appointed over the administration of the province of Babylon, namely Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have disregarded you, and they do not serve your gods or worship the golden image which you have set up.' What if you were Hananiah, Mishael, or Azariah? You've already been in your position now 10 years. You're comfortable. But now you recognize that though you may have genuflected, bent the knee, compromised in some of the issues, your Jewish identity really has been forgotten by some because your name is now a Babylonian name. You were exalted to this position. People serve you. Who are you really? But regardless of their position, these three men now have got to make a moral choice. This was not just an issue of a ceremonial encumbrance. I have to obey or I forfeit my life. And of course, you have to remember there are thousands of people around this image. The king and his court up on a temporary platform area large enough to surround a huge furnace that can be stoked. A loud herald is able to proclaim. Sound travels over the distance. What would you do? You know your faith. You know what's required. What would you end up doing? Well, right here I begin to think, where was Daniel? My personal opinion, and this again is from the Vernoy version, in chapter 3, I want you to look at verse number 24. After the men have been thrown into the fire and they're still alive, notice this particular phrase that occurs in verse number 24. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astounded and stood up in haste. And he said to his, who? High officials. I think Daniel was there. And I'm thinking there's a particular trauma that Daniel now is beginning to face. Because if you look at the third trauma there, I think number 3 is, did I put my friends in the line of fire? This question right now immediately is going through Daniel's mind. He's probably there with the king, being a high official. The high officials were addressed. Daniel's probably there. But all this time, Daniel, in his administration and his duties, knew the king was doing something, did not know what. So he ends up, there's anxiety that's going on. He's able to see the construction that's occurring. He's beginning to remember the dream that was interpreted. Nebuchadnezzar's pride and his arrogance after the continual victories with only the kingdom of Judah to remain. And Daniel's beginning to think, what's to become of my country? And now this, to where his friends are put into the line of fire. Now, we did not focus on this much last week, but look at chapter 2. When Daniel did interpret that dream for King Nebuchadnezzar, verse number 48 says, "Then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many great gifts." Remember, he's still a young man, not even 20. He's between 15, 17 years of age. Then the king promoted Daniel, gave him many great gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. Now look at verse number 49. "And Daniel made request of the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the administration of the province of Babylon, while Daniel was where? In the king's court." Who approached the king to promote his friends? Daniel did. And now Daniel is on the stage before the image when the command goes out to everyone to bow and worship. And Daniel's trauma then now just starts to reverberate through his mind. Am I responsible for putting my friends in the line of fire? Number 4, responsibility was the actual result of that. Number 4, his probable question was, am I responsible for sending them into the situation? Could it be that guilt was a feeling that Daniel may have had in this particular moment? I'm the one that approached the king. I opened the door for them to get that position. I'm responsible now. Was it in God's will for me to do that? Was I actually helping them by putting them in that situation to where they're going to receive open criticism, always be under the microscope, and every decision examined by enemies who want to take them down? Am I responsible for that? I think that's a serious trauma. That if that begins to go over and over and over in our mind and there's no grace that comes from God, and we don't look to God for that kind of grace and for answers to those troubling questions, I very sensibly think that that is something that could have happened. And then number 5, you see the fickleness of the king's favor. This was legit fear. Verse number 13. Allow me to read it. 13 through 23. "Then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and anger, gave orders to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then these men were brought before the king. And Nebuchadnezzar responded and said to them, 'Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up?' See, the king that had so recently promoted them just a few years back was so content with the reliability and diligence that they had shown. Now all of a sudden, he's ready to throw them into the furnace of fire. Are you ready? Verse number 15. "Now, if you are ready," it's like he gives them a second chance. "At the moment you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, the trigon, the psaltery, the bagpipe, and all kinds of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, very well. But if you do not worship, you will immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. And what God is there who can deliver you out of my hands?" What would you decided? You know, they had already made a decision. They stood the first time the music happened. Now Nebuchadnezzar calls them. He almost is shocked that somebody would not fall down and not worship. It's almost like he's trying to completely solidify his control within his empire. All the vassal states are there with representatives. All of his own sub-leaders are there. Every group, military, civil, financial, they're all there. And he's trying to not only establish his civil reign, but he's almost setting himself up as a god. What God is there that can deliver you out of my hand? Do you believe in a God who is worthy and who is able? Well, right then, those three men knew without a doubt, we're ready. Even though King Nebuchadnezzar gave him a second chance, Shadrach, verse 16, Meshach and Abednego replied to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter. There's no hesitancy on our part. And yes, in our minds, there is a God who is able. We don't have to answer you." Verse 17 says, "If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." All right, there was the stand. They made their stand. Okay, now let's begin to look. We've seen the trauma. Let's begin to look at the grace that they applied to their own lives. Okay, number one, I think a principle we can take away from this is discern the laws that violate worship to God. Discern the laws that violate worship to God. Now, this week, take some time, because remember, there's what's called a ceremonial law, and there's also called the moral laws that the Lord ends up making. If you look at your notes underneath the ceremonial law, you see that there's three different examples. You have Daniel, Hananiah, and Mishael, and Azariah. Well, this is from chapter 1. Remember the ceremonial law that commanded the Jews, you can't eat of this particular food. Well, once these boys got to Babylon, what were they being fed? The very food that they weren't supposed to eat. So this is a violation of a ceremonial type law. Okay, remember, what did Daniel do? Scripture says that Daniel had found favor in front of the eyes of the commander. So Daniel heads to the commander, and the commander says, "Forget you, buddy. Ain't no way that's happening, because my head's going to roll. Forget it. Appeal, not accepted. Decision, rejected." So Daniel goes back. Does he stop there? No. Remember, the point was strive ahead despite setbacks. What did Daniel do? Instead of going to the commander, he goes to his supervisor, the guy that was in charge of Daniel and his buddies. And so Daniel says, "Okay, I struck out. Didn't happen with the other, so I'll go to my supervisor and say, look, let's just try a test for 10 days. Let me eat vegetables so that I don't violate the law." See, this was a ceremonial issue, and Daniel tried to do his best to discern. This was not necessarily a moral law, but Daniel, God blessed, and after eating their vegetables, their appearance was better, and so the supervisor said, "I'll let you guys eat whatever you want to eat. It's easier on me anyway." So Daniel won that little thing. Now, study the case of Naaman. Look at it. Let me just give you a brief overview quickly. Naaman was a Syrian commander who was a leper. He goes to Elisha, and Elisha says, go down to the Jordan, wash yourself 7 times, and you'll be healed. Well, it's interesting, the details that take place. Naaman finally goes down, washes, comes back, and he's cleansed. Okay? So Naaman then ends up saying, what do I do? Because part of my responsibility as commander of the army is when my master goes into worship in the temple of his God, I'm his right-hand man, I have to go in with him. And when he bows down to worship, and I bow down to worship, what should I do? Okay? In Elisha's mind, obviously, this was a ceremonial law. And he ends up saying to Naaman, go in peace. If that's what you're required to do, go ahead and go in peace. Naaman had already said, and it's interesting because there's one comment in there about Naaman said, well, if you won't take a gift for what you did for me, let me take home with me 2 mule loads full of dirt. What's up with that? Naaman intended to build his own altar with Judean soil to offer sacrifice to this new God he so loved. But what do? I'm being told now I've got to go into a foreign temple and I have to kneel down. My master commands it. What do, Elisha? Elisha says, go in peace. You see, so there's some laws that didn't have to, they were like ceremonial laws. Elisha gives them, don't worry about it. Go ahead and go. Now notice as well, another example of the conquered emigrants. Remember when Assyria conquered Israel? They actually took the Israelites from their land and took them up to Assyria. But the Assyrians as well brought conquered peoples to Israel. Okay? And as they were there, the lions were let loose. That's actually in Leviticus, where God says, if you disobey me, I will even send pestilence, famine, even the beasts of the field will prey upon you. Well, these immigrants are now here. Man, the lions are in abundance. Everything's taking place. Long story short, in that whole passage, it says that the immigrants feared God, but they served their own idols. They saw no problem with breaking ceremonial laws. Well, I'll do what God requires here so a lion doesn't eat me, but I'm going to serve my gods on the side and do what I want to do. And keep in mind, when Elisha said that to Naaman, it was a commendation of liberty. Go in peace. God's not going to judge you for that. Break that ceremonial law, no problems. But yet to the conquered immigrants, it was a condemnation of sin. Where they should have been fearing God and serving and loving Him, they were doing it on the outside, giving the necessary required ceremonial obedience, but in their hearts, I will serve my own God. I will do what I want to do when I want to do it. So here's the point. Discern the laws that violate worship to God. I am sure that Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael had it up to here, and when Nebuchadnezzar said, bow down and worship these idols, these guys finally said, no, I have obeyed you long enough. I now choose to serve my God, and He has told me not to bow, not to worship. I'm not going to do it. Sometimes we get so frustrated with these commands that violate our convictions. Now keep in mind, you know the distinction between conveniences and convictions? I fear that sometimes as Christians we serve the Lord out of convenience. What's a good day to go? I feel fine. I'm going to go pay my respects at the church, fellowship with the brethren. It's convenient for me. For others, the Lord's Day, it's a conviction. So much to the point If my job requires me continually to work on a Sunday, when I applied to them and said I don't want to work on a Sunday, oh, that's fine. We'll schedule in just once in a while. We'll go ahead and do it. And then once you're in and scheduled, boom, every Sunday, man, you got to work. How long can you put up with that? You know, in your heart, it's violating what you want to do. You know that God wants to give you greater blessing by your obedience to Him, and it just comes to the point where finally, that's it. And boy, I can just imagine those three men. They were at that point on that day, and they said, no. With all the bravado, the valor, and courage that just came up within, God's grace was there to help them in a time of need, and they said, no, I will not do it. And my God, if He delivers me, so be it. If He doesn't, I'm happy just as well. Now, notice something about that. We'll see it at the very end. I don't want to run out of time again. My wife gave me the ultimatum. Don't you be late. Yes, dear. So, what we get, number one, discern the laws that violate God, worship to God. Number two, demonstrate who is worthy. You see, that's how those guys demonstrated who was worthy. God was worthy to them. And they demonstrated it by not bowing. And it's almost like they dared someone to turn him in. And when someone turned him in, I get to go to the principal's office. And there they stood. Where was the trauma? Where was the distress? Where was the anxiety? Where was the fear? You know, and I'm sure Daniel hears the whole time, you know, I can't help. Am I responsible for this? He's praying the whole time, Lord, I don't know what you're going to do. But I'm sure as well he's praying for those guys, and he was very proud of the way those guys were acting. But number three, not only did they demonstrate who was worthy by standing up and saying no, number three, they declared who was worthy. By what they said, verse, if it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from your hand. What God can save you from my hand? Our God is able to save us from your hand if He wants to. Do you think those guys believed that God was worthy and God was able? They most certainly did. They most certainly did. So they, number three, declared who was worthy. Our God is able and our God is God. Let me read the final verses, verse number 24. You know how they stoked the fire 7 times? Even the warriors that were up on that level that ended up casting the men into the furnace, they were the ones that were killed as well. Verse number 24 now, or 23. But these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire, still tied up. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astounded, stood up in haste. You can imagine him the whole time, in rage, upset, but he's sitting on his throne, into the fiery furnace. But he stands up in haste, and he said to his high officials, was it not 3 men that we cast bound into the midst of the fire? They replied to the king, certainly, O king. Now, right here, stop. If Daniel was, and remember this comes from the Vernoy version, if Daniel was in the group of the high officials, and Nebuchadnezzar stands up, looks into the furnace and says, didn't we cast 3 men into the fire all tied up? I think right now, if Daniel had been traumatized, Daniel right now is extremely happy. Oh, yes, sir, we threw 3 of them in. How many are in there now? 4. You bet. We did it. Yeah, look what's going on. Now, I'm sure he didn't get too braggadocious. You know, Daniel was cool. He was pretty smart about it. But can you imagine his response? in prayer, probably in tears, seeing what's going on, and then seeing the miracle happen right there. Was it 3 men we threw into the fire? It certainly was. That satisfaction of the moment, seeing God's miracle right before his very eyes. Why is it that there's 4 now in the furnace? Verse 25, Nebuchadnezzar, look, I see 4 men loosed and walking about in the midst of the fire without harm. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the furnace of blazing fire. He responded and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, come out, you servants of the Most High God, and come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the midst of the fire. The satraps, the prefects, the governors, the king's high officials gathered around and saw in regard to these men that the fire had no effect on the bodies of these men, nor was the hair of their heads singed, nor were their trousers damaged, nor had the smell of fire even come upon them. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants who put their trust in him, violating the king's command, and yielded up their bodies so as to not serve or worship any god except their own. Your last point here as we close. I want you to write down this statement. Because these 3 men, this is what they believed in their moment of trauma. Death is deliverance, not destruction. Death is deliverance. You know, to us, when death occurs, it's loss. It's painful. But from God's eyes, God's delivering us. To your loved one that you had to let go of, God delivered them. That's what death is to the Christian. What do we have to fear then? If we see death as God delivering us and taking us to him, what is there to fear? These 3 men, and even Daniel, they learned some great lessons that night. They relied on God's grace, and no one was left behind. Father, we again thank you for your word. Even as Drew's talking about the history of the Bible, even as Walt's talking about the attributes of God, you reveal yourself to us through your word, and we know you are good. We know that you are love. And we know, Lord, that you allow difficult things to happen in our life because you walk through them with us. We will never be abandoned. We will never be left behind. You promise to rescue, you promise to redeem, and you give the gift of eternal life. Father, yet even today, there is healing in your grace. And there is eternal salvation when we come to you in faith, trusting in Christ to save us.